Yes, good break. I always get the afternoon session, so we hopefully won't fall asleep and whatnot. But basically, like what Paul said, I'm going to be talking about the manager's perspective and just kind of some practical experience that I've learned over the years. So kind of the outline that I'll go through is I work on McKenzie River Ranger District and how we're trying to achieve variable density thinning. Go into a little bit in depth on designation by description and also go into some of the issues associated with variable density thinning, and then give considerations to uneven age management. So, as we've kind of heard, the National Forest System for the last probably 10 years, actually since the Northwest Forest Plan came out, predominantly is basically doing thinning treatments. We've kind of, in the last couple years, transitioned into using some skips and gaps and some of the other aspects, and I'll kind of get into that later. But predominantly has been thinning. And variable density thinning has gotten the most public support and a lot of attention in the last couple of years. So we've kind of been gearing towards that and using that in our environmental documents. And kind of the aspect of it is that it sounds good because you're basically variable density, you're putting diversity out there, so it's kind of a intermixed thinning type treatment. So it sounds better than just thinning, I think is kind of what the public is seeing. So, early 2000s, basically what we did for most of our thinnings, and actually prior to that, was individually mark trees. And we'd either mark the trees that we leave, or we'd mark the trees to cut, and depending on what the density was pre-treatment and which one had more trees, basically to try to keep the paint costs down. So if there was more trees to cut, you would paint the leave trees. If there was more trees to leave, you'd paint the cut trees. And that's kind of the aspects that we did. Here recently, we kind of came up with I don't know who came up with it, but came up with what's called designation by description, or D by D. How many folks have heard D by D, or designation by description? All right, so roughly about half. Of those people that raised their hand, how many people could go out and actually do a D by D prescription? Yeah, okay, quarter. So we'll kind of go over that a little bit and kind of just get a brief aspect of why we're doing D by D. And yeah, it did turn out. So designation by description is basically what we're using on McKenzie River and throughout the Willamette National Forest, and actually for the most part in Region 6 for a lot of our thinning sales. And the reason why is because it allows us to not have to go out and mark the trees ourselves. We basically put that on the purchaser or the contract, and they can go out there and either mark the trees or maybe they decide not to mark the trees. So it basically saves us money both in time and also in paint, because the paint that we use has tracer in it and it's pretty expensive. So that being said, we basically went to this system, and that's basically what we're doing predominantly to achieve our variable density thinning. And kind of how it works is I'll start off with the stand, which is about 260 trees per acre. This is about an acre for right now. And we'll kind of put in a 15 D by D prescription, which is about 23 or 22 foot residual spacing, which is about 95 trees per acre is what we'll end up with. So the first thing you want to do is basically find a bigger tree. And basically the idea within that 15 foot spacing is you're going to keep the biggest tree within that radius, and you're going to cut all the other trees around it. And the idea basically being it maximizes growth, kind of what David was talking about in terms of stand dynamics. It basically allows the most light and nutrients to allow for that tree, and also gives us the spacing that we like. It also creates some variability, which we'll see coming up. So if you cut the trees, then you go on to the next one, and you can see that that's the biggest tree of those ones. So you cut that one, all the trees around there. You go to the next tree over there, and it looks like the other tree that's in the radius is about the same size. So you're going to want to measure the tree that you're at, and then you want to go measure that tree, and whichever one's bigger is the one you're going to keep. So with that being said, now you moved over to that tree, and now you have two trees that look to be about the same size. So you'd go measure the other tree and find out which one's the biggest, and whichever one was the biggest, which in this case was the middle one, you'd cut all the other trees. So ideally, it's a thinning from below is what we call it, but as you can see right there, it's not a true thinning from below because you do take out some of the trees that are if you have codominants that are right next to each other, you end up taking out maybe 2 codominants or 2 dominants. But we still consider it a thinning from below because predominantly the trees that we're cutting are from the lower portion of the stand. So you keep going throughout the stand, and you basically end up with something that looks like that. And what you can see is you get some variability, kind of, well, you can't really see that. Oh, right in there, you know, you'll have a big patch right there. You have some other patches here. But for the most part, you kind of get that variability out there, and it's not like a row type plantation. So you end up getting some variability. The more uniform the stand is to start, the more uniform it's probably going to be at the end. So that's D by D. That's what we're doing. So the other aspects that we do in our thinning prescriptions is we put in skips or no harvest areas. These could be riparian areas, or they could be cultural sites that we're trying to protect, or special habitat areas, or just trying to create some diversity out there, and we'll end up putting a skip out there just for diversity. And what that will look like is you can see, you know, you have these trees, and basically what you do is you'd mark around these and basically make a leave island, so no trees would be cut in there, and then you have another one down there where no trees would be cut. Okay, then there's gaps, and on the McKenzie district, for the most part, unless you're in LSR, which we go with the half-acre gaps and LSRs, late successional reserves, we're going 1 to 3 acres of gaps. And basically that's trying to create that diversity, some of that early cereal habitat, and also create a new stand of regeneration of Douglas fir coming up. And that would be kind of what that looks like. Obviously this isn't, if this was a 1 acre chunk to start off with, you know, this isn't 1 to 3 acres, but it kind of shows the idea. Okay, the other aspect that we've added in the last couple years is, as I kind of like it, it's a dominant, what we call a dominant tree release, which is basically a 1/4 acre gap around 1 or 2 trees. And we might end up increasing that to maybe 3 or 4, depending on the variability. But you basically end up with a, let's see if I can get back there. There it is. End up with a tree, and then you basically cut 66 feet around that tree, and you end up with basically a 1/4 acre gap around the tree. And the idea behind this is to create that open stand condition for these individual trees. So rather than creating the open stand condition across the whole entire stand, you're picking individual trees, and preferably the dominant trees that have the most potential, as trying to basically create that open grown type, you know, the legacy wolf tree type function. So ideally we'd like to do these in younger stands, because that way you're able to capture that full crown width, and it'll keep that full crown width longer as it keeps increasing in height. So that's kind of the idea behind it. We just started implementing this in the last 2 projects, and I think on the Willamette National Forest, Sweet Home Ranger District also implemented this as well. Then to add even more complexity, we might do all these systems in 1 unit. And I'll kind of go into that, but I'll give you a brief kind of transition of what this looks like. So here's your pre-treatment of the stand. If you went through and did a D by D, that's what it looks like. There's the D by D with skips, D by D with dominant tree release, D by D with gaps. Now we're going to start getting a little more complicated, D by D with skips and gaps, so you have both the skips and the gaps. That'll create the light transition. It'll be like we talked about yesterday and again somewhat today. You kind of get that influence of the light from the gaps, and also some of that influence in the shade from the skips. So you'll get kind of a good transition there. And then we also do in a lot of our thinnings a D by D with basically small tree retention. And basically in the contract we'll write you won't cut any trees 7 inches or below 7 inches. So you'll end up with a bunch of these little small trees that might be, you know, 6 inches or so, that might be hemlocks or red cedars or maybe Douglas firs that are just hanging on and whatnot. So you might end up with that. And then we also have a D by D with species retention. A lot of times, like with western red cedar, we want to retain that to try to create that or increase the diversity of the stand. So if we don't have very much red cedar in there in terms of codominant and dominant trees, and we want to get that, we're going to want to, so the blue would be your red cedars, and you're going to keep that. So you basically say in the contract, D by D spacing of 15 and don't cut any red cedars, and the contract is pretty simple, kind kind of contract to implement. And then here's one with all of them. So you can see how kind of complex it gets, and we definitely do all of them in one stand occasionally. Less so all of them in one stand than maybe just a few in some. But so here's what it looks like on the ground. So this is a recent, actually harvested last year, where you have the gaps, you have a riparian area with a skip, you have some skips right in here, and then you got some thinning in between. Then you have thinning here with, you can see what a variable density thinning, obviously you have some skyline corridors creating some of that variability, but you still have quite a bit of variability in here, and then with some gaps. And then this one's just putting in a gap, and I don't think they've thinned the rest. So you can see kind of the variability that you get out there on the landscape, and then you just have the thinning right there that you can get on the landscape. So it's really been impressive for the diversity. I don't know if this is on BLM land or if it's on private, but basically it's up 126, Highway 126, and I looked at it, and you can see the variability that they're doing out there. And you basically have a thinning right in here with some gaps nearby, some bigger gaps here with some thinning in between. You got a riparian area, so you can see there's not just federal ground that this is going on, it's also on private ground, and it's making it economical. So here's, in terms of complexity, you guys think that map, what do you guys think? Is that pretty complex? You guys understand what's going on with it? So this is what we give our contractors. This is a unit that we put out for sale last year. So you basically have all these 102s and 101s are gaps put in. So we have to go out there and lay out the gaps. And then you have different D by D prescriptions within this unit. And then this unit's another D by D prescription. And then you have a riparian area right here with a skip in there. You also have a special management area right here with a skip. And I think that is about it for this. But you can see how complicated it gets and what you can do. So in terms of layout costs, which I'll go into kind of issues with increased unit complexity. So basically in terms of physical layout, it's really intensive, because rather than going around this unit like back in 30 years ago, you'd march around this unit and then be done with, and then you'd have them go in and cut the unit. Well now, we used to actually go in and put out the unit and then go through and mark it, so we're not doing that anymore, but we're adding in all the gap placements that you're putting in. So you have all these gaps that you have to go around, GPS, and flag and tag and make sure that it's visible for folks to see. So in terms of physical layout, it's definitely a lot more complicated. GPSing, obviously with technology, it's getting a lot easier, because you can go out there, you can kind of predefine where your skips and gaps are located and go out there and put them in, but it still takes a lot more time. It also takes a lot more time for cruising, because you're gonna have to stratify these all out. Now what we've done is basically all these gaps within a unit, we'll put that as one stratification, so you don't have to have each one of those units be a separate stratification, but it still increases time in terms of that. And one of the aspects that Lauren was talking about with Young Stand Study is why he didn't see a increase in layout costs, was because they were back doing a lot of they had to walk through the unit anyways, painting all the leaf trees. So now that we're not painting the leaf trees, we see a lot, basically almost twice as much time and money that goes into laying out these units, because we have to walk all these different units. In riparian areas, you have to walk up and then down the other side too. And then sometimes we'll have riparian areas with different prescriptions. So you'll have a no-cut riparian area, and then you'll have a no-cut no-cut riparian area, and then a riparian area with a different prescription than the rest of the unit. So you're actually going down the unit, coming back, going down on the other side of the stream, and coming back. So again, everything that you do out there definitely adds up in terms of layout costs. It also adds to the implementation side of it. So when you give a contractor this, there's a lot more room for error, because it's a lot more complex, and our sale administrators have to be able to understand that and be able to implement it. So we need to keep that into consideration when we're putting these out, because everything sounds good on paper, but it's a lot harder to implement. More complex maps, and yeah. So one of the aspects that I talked about is the riparian areas. We went to a stand that we thinned. We basically wanted a 50% retention, canopy cover retention in a riparian area, and then 40% in the rest of the unit. And what was interesting is it was basically 70 trees per acre versus 100 trees per acre. And if you didn't have the line posted, you probably wouldn't be able to see the transition. So was it really worth the extra time it took the layout crew to go in there and make that type of a transition? I think if you had like a 50 to 30%, which is kind of what the Young Stand study had with the 60 trees per acre versus the 120 trees per acre, you get a lot more variation. You can actually start to see some of that aspect. But a 10% canopy cover, you just got to ask yourself, is it really worth the extra time to do it? And if your answer is yes, it's great. And I'm not saying yes or no. It's just something to consider. The other aspects is your next entry. So if your entry is going to be in 10 years, we figure about 2% per year is what we're getting for canopy covers to respond. It's probably a little bit less in the Cascades and the coast where that study was done. But either way, in 10 years, you're getting basically 20% canopy cover. So if you're planning on going in there in 15 years, is it really worth, again, having that extra 10%? Are you buying yourself anything? Or if you're going in there 30 years, if your next entry is in there in 30 years, then you might be buying yourself to go down a little bit lower. But it all depends on objectives. So if you're in it for timber production, you probably want to thin a little bit lighter. If you're in it for compaction, you don't want to have the compaction issues or the resource damage of going in there and harvesting. Maybe you want to thin a little bit less. So there was a question earlier about the sweet spot, and I don't know if there's an actual sweet spot, but it goes back to basically how they answered it. It depends on your objectives. And then, yeah. So one of the aspects that I want to talk about that we're really getting into now is some uneven age management. And this diagram, it looks all right. Basically, within one unit, the idea is to have older trees, regeneration, some younger trees, and then some mature trees all within one stand. Now, depending on how you distinguish mature and whatnot, if you want a 60-year rotation, you won't have as many of the trees in here. If this is like a 100-year rotation or a 120-year rotation, you're going to be able to get this type of dynamics, and you might be able to have 6 cohorts in there or 5 cohorts, where if you were doing a younger rotation, you might end up only having 3 or 4. So that's uneven age management. You just got to think about that in terms of that. So one of the aspects with uneven age management is gap placement or group select placement, especially in an intermediate support type situation when you need these trees, especially for future harvesting. You might not want to put in a gap right there and leave your intermediate support trees sitting there, because if a big gust of wind comes in and blows out your intermediate support, you're basically left with not being able to harvest these trees down here if your gap's big enough that you can't get to it. So just be cognizant of that. Maybe the idea would be to put your gaps in a little bit higher or a little bit lower, and then thinning in here to get some of that wind firmness for the thinning, and then place the gap later on. Another aspect, and I know need time, running low on time, is the sun angle. So if you have a north-facing slope, a lot of the studies that we've done, especially with the Young Stand study, were done on flat ground for the most part. So the angle of the sun was a little bit different than you'd get on the north-facing slope. So it's just something to consider. During the summer months, you're getting light in the middle of that, but in the winter months, you won't even get light within that gap. And just considerations to follow. Other considerations, real quick, is just tracking the variation in the units. It becomes basically important into the future and will allow you to have better stand data in the future. The take-home message for me is basically vary your treatments across the landscape. Don't provide that one-size-fits-all. Nature didn't do it. When fires came through or whatever disturbance mechanisms you had, but the one-size-fits-all probably isn't appropriate. And if anything with this conference is the take-home message is just to vary. And I'll take questions or comments.
Do we have time for a question? Okay, thank you, Kurt.
So with the description there and your marking, is there a way to bring in a marking that cuts across the diameter distribution or leads across the full speed of diameter distribution ranges?
Yeah, actually, I have not dealt with this personally, but what I've heard is you could do basically a designation by description by diameter. So if you have a smaller diameter tree, you're basically going to have a lower or smaller spacing. So you might have like a 10-foot spacing on an 8-inch tree versus a 15-inch spacing or 15-foot spacing on a 15-inch tree or something like that. So you can kind of add that intermix and get even more variation out there, but it hasn't been used as much as just strictly the D by D.